What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. Today, Randy and I are going to be talking about the top 5 jig fishing mistakes that new anglers make, experienced anglers make, pretty much everyone makes. And hopefully by the end of this stream, you guys are going to be a lot better at jig fishing. I know, Randy, if I could pick one bait to throw year-round, any condition, any lake in the country, it would be a jig, hands down. You could take every other bait away from me, and that's the one bait I would throw above any other bait. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, Johnny. If I've always said if you can get them going on a jig, you're so far ahead of anything else because it's been my experience that jig fish on the average will weigh like anywhere between a quarter to a half pound more than any other bait you can fish, really. So it's a quality fish bait, man. I always look for a jig bite, always.
Awesome. So you guys are definitely in for a treat. Randy's been fishing jigs twice as long as I've been alive, practically, and I've been throwing jigs most of my life. So hopefully you guys are going to learn some really good stuff. And thanks for everyone tuning in for the live feed. We got William, Josh, Timo, Gone Fishing, and we got a $5 super chat from William Clark. Appreciate that. Thanks for that. We got PK, Scott, Dan, Bill, Shane. How's everyone doing? We got a bunch of guys saying that they love fishing jigs, and a lot of guys who said they've never caught a fish in a jig before ever. So hopefully both of those groups of guys will learn something tonight. And before we get into that, Randy, just want to make a couple announcements. First, congratulations on getting 10,000 subscribers on your YouTube channel. That's awesome.
Oh, thanks, man. I can't believe it. Like I said, I just started this, like a year ago, and it's just, man, like I said, I'm just really grateful and humbled about everybody coming on board with it. I mean, because like I said, if you've seen my stuff, it's pretty low tech, it's pretty basic stuff, and I just big thanks to everybody that's watching them.
For sure, you're making some great content, pumping it out daily. If you haven't seen Randy's channel, head over to YouTube, and it's Randy Blockett Intuitive Angler, right?
Yeah, intuitive angling, Randy Blockett.
Yeah, Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett. Awesome. And so another thing I wanted to talk about was I had the craziest 2 days of fishing, Randy. I was telling you about this a little bit, but man, I am just still blown away with how I was catching fish the last few days. I was filming a video about the Garmin Live Scope, and I've been hearing about guys catching fish on this one lake by my house where they're literally fishing in the dead center of the lake, like the middle of the lake, no structure around, nothing, and they were on big balls of gizzard shad. And there were big schools of fish chasing gizzard shad in the middle of the lake. And you could see them in the morning popping on the surface and stuff, and a couple of guys that I know were following them around with their live scope and catching a few fish. Well, I went out there and I absolutely hammered them in the middle of the winter on this giant Megabass Mag Draft swim bait with a 1 ounce underspin head, and I was fishing over 60 feet of water randomly in the middle of the lake. Like, there wasn't a ditch, there wasn't a drain, it was just the center of the lake with nothing around. And these fish were suspended on big gizzard shad, and I was following these schools of shad and fish around for like 3 hours, just like over 100 to 300 yard area. I was just randomly following them around. Every once in a while, I get that big swim bait in front of them, and I would catch like a 3, 4, or 5 pounder. And I caught 10 fish over 4 pounds, had a couple 6 pounders. It was insane. And I have a video coming up about it, but I just wanted to let you guys know about that day because it was blowing my mind. And it just shows you that live scope is absolutely going to change fishing forever, especially tournament fishing.
Yeah, and it shows everybody that there's a population of fish that are out there and they're catchable that nobody knew existed before.
Yep.
I mean, literally, I guess it's just as easy for a bass to swim out in the middle of the lake as it is for him to swim under a boat dock or something. But that's the biggest thing Live Scope has done. It's really tapped into that unknown, part of the offshore fishing nobody could figure out before.
For sure. So I just wanted to share that little tidbit, but let's jump straight into it, Randy. We got 170 people already on, so let's get into the main heart of the content. So first item on the list of the 5 common jig fishing mistakes that most anglers make is that most guys, when they start picking up a jig, are not fishing it around a specific target. What I mean by that is that they're not intentionally taking that jig and throwing it at an object or a spot in the middle of the lake. And I want to explain that a little bit just to kind of give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about. And I have Google Earth pulled up here, and I just want to show you some areas on a lake that actually that's drawn down about 15 feet. It's a little lake by my house, or that I used to fish by my house, that is loaded with big fish, and I've caught probably about 2,000 jig fish on this lake, give or take, over about 7 or 8 years. And there's a ton of cool things you can see with this lake drawn down. If we take a look kind of in this area, for example, we have this really nice rocky ridge that sticks out. And again, if you take the lake up, that ridge is normally completely underwater. But when we take the lake down, you can see it's here. So usually you can fish this. There's like 10 foot of water on this. But right now, the lake's down, just to give you guys an example. And this is a great example of something that I would be throwing a jig on. It's this random like pond levee that has some rock on it and it's sitting off the bank. Another great example is this little brush pile right here that's sticking out in the middle of the lake. Or maybe this old road where you can see there's a little road with a blowout right there. That's where I'd be fishing. But the key with all of this is that all of the areas I'm fishing a jig are going to be small, little areas like this right here, or maybe that brush pile right here, or maybe the tip of that pond levee. And these are all offshore areas, guys, but you can apply the same thing. For example, if you look up here when the lake is high, here's an isolated grouping of trees that are a little bit bigger and off the bank. That might be the area I'm picking to fish the jig in. Either way, the areas I'm focusing on are areas that are maybe 20 to 30 feet in a circle. So you're going to be basically doing like a kind of a 20-foot square area, something like that, where I'm going to be throwing that jig. And I'm going to be focusing on just fishing that jig in that one specific spot. I think a lot of guys get messed up when they're trying to fish jigs because they try to fish them like they do a lot of other baits that maybe are more effective for them. Spinner baits, crank baits, things like that. And they're just randomly throwing them down the bank. And that even works like a Texas rig worm and stuff like that. You can just kind of cast them down the bank and sometimes pick up a fish. But with a jig, the number one key to getting bit is you have to be throwing that jig on a very specific target. And I'm never just going down the bank just fishing a jig, hardly ever. It's always on a very specific targeted spot, whether it's offshore or up shallow. Another example I'll pull up is over here on Beaver Lake, which is a rock transition that I fish sometimes in the winter and in the spring. Here, if we go scroll into this area, you can see that there's a really nice transition from this steep bluff wall to this pea gravel bank over here, and there's some chunk rock in between. And this transition from the steep bluff to that chunk rock, or to the pea gravel with the chunk rock in between, that's maybe no more than a 20-yard stretch of bank. And that's what I'm going to be fishing my jig on. A very small section. I'm not just going to pick up the jig, start in the mouth of this creek, and fish the entire creek. One, that's very inefficient because you have to fish a jig slow, which we'll get into in a little bit, to be effective. But at the same time, these key little stretches are where a lot of the fish are going to be holding as well. So usually a jig is a bait that you throw once you have a good feeling that the fish are in a certain spot. It's not a bait to cover water, just go out to just go fish with. It's a bait that once you've dialed in where the fish are, you actually use it to maximize that area, catch more fish out of that area. And that's something I think a lot of guys struggle with in general, is just finding a good area to catch fish. And that's why jigs are a little bit more advanced in terms of skill needed to actually fish them, is because you have to have a good understanding of where those fish are and where these 20-yard stretches or 20-foot square areas are the fish are holding on. And so that's kind of what I'm always looking for when I want to fish a specific spot with a jig. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially when you're fishing offshore. For me, let me share my screen here. I'll talk a little bit about the shallow jig that I do, most of my fishing around. Let's see. You see my Google Earth there, Johnny?
Got it pulled up.
Okay. Now, the thing that I'm looking for, we're talking again about specific, where you're just not randomly throwing a jig everywhere. When you're talking about fishing shallow cover, and here's a great example of a typical Highland reservoir. This is Stockton Lake, but this lake is set up very similar to almost any man-made reservoir that has, a combination of different types of cover in it. Right here, you got a flat bank with a lot of lay-down wood, and here back in the creek, you got some buck brushes that they can be in anywhere between 6 inches to 5 feet of water, depending upon the level of the lake. But what you have when you're talking about jig fishing on specific spots, shallow cover, you have spots within spots. So say for example, on this bug brush island right here, let's just say the water, there's 3 foot of water in the bushes. When you come up to one of these bushes here, one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make that don't have a lot of fishing experience specifically with the jig is they don't really know where to key in on around like a bush right here. And there's going to be spots within that spot that you need to put that jig in. And most of the time it's going to be darker areas. It's going to be areas of the bush that is a little bit more complex, but it's going to be an area that's large enough for a fish to be able to set in there comfortably. It's not like you want to flip in a super, super tight spot. You want to flip into a spot that's like as big as maybe a coffee can lid or something like that. And based upon how the direction of the sun or the wind is going to determine how that fish is positioned around that bush. And a lot of times, each one of these bushes is different. It's set up different. The light's hitting a little bit different. The angle, the water depth's a little bit different of it. There's areas within that specific piece of cover that you really want to target with that jig. And it's the same if you move over and start fishing the isolated laydowns. There's going to be specific spots that you want to put that jig in. It's not like you just want to fan cast it everywhere around the laydown or, in the open areas around it. There's going to be a part of that laydown that's a little, maybe throwing some shade off. There'll be one part of that laydown that maybe has got a little bit of a root wad on it that creates a little bit more of a complex piece of cover. And that's where you want to put that jig at, those high percentage areas, because when you're flipping down a bank like this that has a lot of cover, you got to be able to balance out the gist of fishing thoroughly, yet covering water. So if you just fished every single square inch of every corner of the laydown here, it'd take you forever to cover any water. But by knowing where to put that jig at in those high percentage areas on shallow cover, it's really going to maximize your time on the water and the number of bites you get versus the time you fish it.
For sure. And another thing, too, in that image, Randy, if you can pull up like an isolated laydown, that's always something that's key whenever you're fishing up shallower. If you can find an isolated target that's away from any other object, that's always going to be very important. Basically, what Randy talked about is like you want to find something that's either really gnarly, like the thickest cover among all of the other covers. So if everything's kind of just 1 or 2 branches and then you come up with a tree that has 30 branches, that's going to be better. And then like what Randy has pulled up there.
Yeah, like right here, you've got this little isolated laydown right here out away from everything. This would be a high percentage area that you could put that jig in, fish thoroughly around.
And a lot of times when I'm jig fishing, Randy, and I'm sure it's the same for you, I don't get bit on every single one of these high percentage areas. What you have to do is throw your jig in a lot of those areas. And the key is that when you're going through, whether it's on the bank or whether it's offshore, you want to make sure that that jig is in that productive zone the majority of the time you're throwing it. Do you want to be in that gnarliest cover, the isolated cover, the offshore sweet spots I was showing earlier? And if that bait isn't in those zones most of the time you're fishing, you're not going to catch that many fish in a jig, because on average, a jig is not going to generate 30, 40 bites a day. Usually it's like a 5 to 10 bite a day sort of bait, even when you're fishing in the most high percentage areas. But it's going to generate those bigger bites. So your 5 fish on a jig are in a way 2 to 5, maybe 6 pounds heavier than any other bait, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and we'll cover that here a little bit later in the podcast. But like I said, when you're talking about flipping down through here a jig on all this cover here, there's a tremendous amount of variables involved in it that we're going to cover a little bit later. So not only do you have to worry about positioning and putting that jig into the sweet spot, everything else has to line up perfectly around that to get that bite too. We've literally got dozens of variables that can possibly exist around throwing a jig on this piece of wood right here that we'll talk about here in a second.
Yeah, and let's just jump right into that actually, Randy. If you could stop sharing your screen, the second most common jig fishing mistake that I see guys make, especially when I'm doing on-the-water fishing lessons or just fishing with buddies, is that they fish a jig under the wrong conditions. And so what I mean by that is they are fishing a jig when it's either windy or cloudy. And the one exception to this basically is the swim jig. The swim jig is by far the most popular jig on the market, and everyone loves throwing a swim jig. And the reason is it's basically like throwing a spinnerbait. You just cast it and you reel it in and you feel them thump it. And that's, to me, like, swim jig fishing is not really jig fishing. It is, but it's more like a spinnerbait or a crankbait than it is a jig. When I think about jig fishing, I'm thinking about a bait that's on the bottom, getting around in and into cover. That's the key. Getting deep into cover around some sort of gnarly object, whether it's big rocks, big laydowns, stuff like that. And whenever you have those situations, one of the keys is finding that sun. And that's something that you talked about here earlier, Randy, and I'm going to pull up that exact same spot, actually, that you showed. And if we go through time, you'll see that on certain days back in this creek, you're going to have more sun or less sun. And so, let me actually find, this is not the best example. Here we go. So like you have a situation here where you have some shade that's cast off these trees. The shade of the trees is going to, or shade around the cover is going to position those fish tight up against an object. And in general, when I'm throwing a jig, 95% of the time it's on a sunny day around some sort of shade that's cast by a brush pile, a dock, a tree, a log. The shade is super key to jig fishing, and I think that's something that's highly overlooked. Now, can you catch fish on a jig when there's no shade? Yes. But you can also usually catch those fish on other baits, like a moving bait. And when I can get away with throwing a moving bait like a spinner bait or a crankbait, I'm going to do that because you can cover a lot more water, you can make a lot more casts in a day. But when it's sunny and calm and there's a bunch of shade on the water because of the sun, usually the crankbaits and the spinnerbaits don't work that well, and the jig is the better option. Therefore, on those days, I'm going to just lock a jig in my hand. But I think that again, is one of the most common mistakes that anglers make is they try to fish a jig in really cloudy conditions, maybe even really windy days. Even like on windy days, fish will eat a spinnerbait, a crankbait, stuff like that better. But when it's calm, when it's sunny, and when there's shade around, the jig is the go-to bait. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Yeah, there's no doubt, especially when you're fishing around like isolated targets, laydowns, docks, that type of stuff. Shade is really key. The only time that I found that shade, that you can catch a lot of fish on a dark condition or shady conditions on a jig is when the water's high. Because one of the best lessons I learned how to flip from the master of flipping, in my opinion, a guy named Terry Thomas here that lives in Southwest Missouri. He's a legend here in the Ozarks. He's probably won as many or more tournaments in Missouri than any angler in the state. And I got a chance for him to teach me how to flip years ago, like 30 plus years ago. And the day that he taught me, we fished a buddy tournament together at Grand Lake. We won the tournament with 28 pounds. We caught like 30 bass that day. Terry caught 29 of them. I caught one of them. We were both flipping a black and blue jig, black and blue pork frog, 30-pound test line into the willow trees. And it was literally a heavy thunderstorm, pouring down rain all day long, flipping willows. The only exception that exists that I have seen is when those fish are committed to a flipping position in flooded cover, you can catch them on shady situations. But other than that, it's just like what you said, Johnny. Isolated cover, wood, laydowns, docks, rocks, whatever like that. Most of the time, shade is going to be key because shade is cover for the fish. It provides an ambush point for them. It makes those bigger fish more aggressive. And you need that aggressiveness when you're fishing a jig, because a jig is not a subtle bait, even a small jig. It's a bait that's designed for bigger fish, aggressive fish, and that shade is key.
For sure. And even J Mav's asking, does the sun play a part when jigging offshore brush piles? Yes. Shade is huge on brush piles. You'll find a lot of times when I'm fishing offshore brush, let me pull up an example here, just from one of these maps. I fish a ton of brush piles. I actually have a really awesome video, Randy, from a couple of days ago. I was throwing the Fisherman offshore jig and called a 7, a 6, and a 5, and a 4 on brush piles, all in a jig. And basically, like if we pull up, here's an example of an area that has a bunch of, let me find it, has a bunch of brush piles around it. You can see, if we go back to like this situation, you can see there's some brush here. Let me find a better brush pile. There's a bunch of them on this lake somewhere. Let me find one that's sticking out. Here we go. So here's a brush pile. So this is a brush pile like this. And what you'll find is that whenever you have a sunny day, even when you're fishing offshore in 15, 20 foot of water, the shade is what those bass will use to ambush bait fish that are swimming around in the middle of the lake on those bright sunny days. On a bright sunny day, the shad can see the bass from a long ways away. Same thing with the bluegill or whatever other forage the bass are feeding on. And so on bright, sunny, calm days, the shad can see the bass coming from a long ways away, especially if you have 2 to 3 foot of water visibility. However, when you have shade, those bass can hang out in that darker area, and those bait fish can't see the bass as easily. And so it's kind of like when you want to jump out and scare someone, you're not going to stand in the middle of a brightly lit room. Instead, you're going to maybe hide behind like a sofa that's shaded, or with some like a darker area, maybe a dark closet or whatever, to jump out. And so those bass, they're going to, a lot of times around brush piles, relate more to the shade than the actual brush pile itself. And I can actually pull up an example on sonar of this, which I think you guys will find really cool. Just give me half a second to pull this up, where you can actually see this happening. And I see this in brush piles all the time, and I don't think a lot of guys really know this, and not something that gets talked about too much. Let me find this. Here we go. Okay. I'm just going to pull this up over here, guys. Sorry, just taking a second to... I had to pull up all these files I was not expecting to talk about. Okay, here we go. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Okay, so got this this spot here, and it's a brush pile that I graphed, and I caught some fish in offshore, and this right here is the brush pile. And you can see the fish right here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fish. And if you notice, a lot of these fish are not actually positioned in the brush pile, even though it's a bright, sunny, calm day. Instead, they're off to the side. And this is actually the shaded side. So if you think about it, like the sun is over here, maybe in the top left corner, and that sun is hitting this brush pile, and these fish are sitting in the shade of that brush. They're not in the brush, they're in the shade of that brush. And this is where you find a lot of fish when you scan brush piles with down imaging. They're off to the right or to the left on sunny days. Now when it's cloudy, the shade isn't there, and because there's no shade there, these fish a lot of times won't actually relate to brush at all. They'll just start randomly swimming around chasing bait fish, and that's what I talked about at the beginning of the stream, where you can catch them just randomly swimming out in the middle with a swim bait or something like that. So when you want to fish like offshore brush piles, the sun is super critical to getting those fish to bite. Now, sometimes bass will kind of be resident fish around certain brush piles, regardless of the conditions. But most of the time when I'm dealing with offshore brush piles, the fish are using the shade of the tree, not so much the tree itself, if that makes sense.
Now, one question I've got on that, Johnny, because I think a lot of viewers may wonder this too, because I don't think a lot of people, this is like when you're talking about deep shade and brush, that most people don't equate that to like an approach in bass fishing. Do you think that those fish, when they're on those deeper brush piles, like that 15, 20, 25 foot of water, do you think they'll come a long distance to get that jig, or do you have to get it in the shade like you do on shallow cover?
You have to get it in the shade. And actually what I find is that most of my bites in a jig on offshore brush come before my bait ever makes contact with the brush. So I'll fire that jig out there, and I'll basically position my boat a lot of times so that I am on the sunny side of the brush pile. So the sun is kind of at my back. That's usually a good practice. And sometimes you don't want to do that to an extent because you don't want the shadow of your boat to get cast in the brush pile, so you have to make sure you stay far enough away. There's a whole thing here to kind of pay attention to with boat positioning. I'll make a video about that at some point. But yeah, basically, you want to make sure that the brush pile is, that your cast is coming so that when you bring your jig to that brush pile, you're bringing it into the shade first, then into the brush. Because what will happen is that those bass are sitting in the shade waiting for that jig to come to the brush. And if you bring it into the brush first and over the top of it on the sunny side, back down the other side, those bass are going to basically maybe potentially miss your jig because it gets caught up in the limbs and they can't see it as well. And one thing I do find is that if I am fishing on the opposite side of a brush pile and I have to cast on the sunny side first, I hop my jig up really high and I'll pop it off the brush, and they'll bite it after the jig is popped way off the top of the brush and is falling into the shady spot. So most of my jig bites, I would say 70% of them on offshore brush piles become when my jig is not actually in the brush. It's on the outer edges around the shade. So,
That is, I don't think, I mean, I'd be curious to hear some comments from the viewers right now. That is some high level bass fishing information, because as long as I've been fishing, I never considered that. I never considered shade a thing when you're fishing deep brush piles. I mean, that is just, that's amazing to me like that. I've never even considered that. Most of the time when I'm fishing deep brush, I just think if I get it anywhere near that brush pile, I've got a chance to catch a fish. So, yeah, I'd be curious to hear if anyone else has considered that before, because I learned something right there myself on that.
yeah, one thing the reason I kind of came to that conclusion is actually not from brush pile fishing. And I've fished brush piles a ton on Lake Dardanelle and all these places that I was showing on the map. So I've fished so many brush piles before. You pick up those things. It's more just through trial and error. But what I kind of learned that from, let me transition over, is when I was fishing boat docks. And if you fish boat docks on like a deep, clear lake, and you've done this, I'm going to go up to like Lake of the Ozarks, for example. You fish Lake of the Ozarks all the time, Randy. I'm sure you've heard this before. But a lot of times what happens is that with these boat docks, the best place to fish on a boat dock a lot of times is not necessarily on the boat dock itself, but a lot of times it's on the shady side of the boat dock. And I catch a lot of my fish on like a dock like this, casting my jig in that shade line, and the shade is what those fish will relate to more than the dock. So like this dock, this side of this dock right here, not going to be as productive usually unless there's a brush pile there than this side of the boat dock where that thicker shade is. And especially if there's like a rock transition or something on the back side of these deep docks, a lot of times the fish aren't even on the dock itself, because the dock might be floating and the bank is, super steep. So out here it might be 30, 40 feet of water, but those fish are relating to a rock transition on the bank. Maybe it goes from pea gravel to chunk rock, and then they're using the shade of that boat dock in 20 to 30 feet of water, and that's what you're catching them on. The shade of the boat dock plus the rock transition. And I figured that out when I was like 16 years old, and I kind of was like, oh, well, maybe that's something with brush piles too, and that's kind of how I put that all together.
And that's how so much about fishing technique is learned. It's just by the haphazard, random, it's just almost a mistake you make. And getting back to swim jigs a little bit, so the whole technique of swim jigs, that was basically discovered off of a mistake of jig fishing flipping.
Yeah.
Because I can remember before, nobody, 30 years ago, nobody knew what a swim jig is, or nobody understood what a swim jig did. Once in a while, you'd get a bite. If you flipped into a bush or grass bed, you get a bite as you're reeling the jig back in. And most of the time, you dismiss that as just the random haphazard until it actually became a thing, just like what you're talking about with the deep shade.
For sure. And that's the thing with fishing. There's so many factors, and you have to consider that. And like, who asked that? It was Stanky Fishing asked, what do they use the dock for in that case? Just shade? What I find is that if you're fishing a dock that's floating, the only thing that matters is the shade to those fish. They don't actually care about the dock itself. It's all about the shade, unless there's a brush pile around the floating dock. Now, if you have docks that have wooden pillars that go down into the bottom, then they're actually using the pillars themselves as an ambush point. The only exception for that is when you have like a shad spawn going on, or the fish are like suspended up underneath the floats of the boat docks. That happens sometimes. But if the fish are on the bottom, they're not there because of the dock most of the time, especially the deeper floating docks. They're there because of the shade. It's kind of all... there's a lot of nuances to everything in fishing, but hopefully that makes sense. Cool. Well, Randy, I do want to talk about some of the jigs that we throw, because I do think that a lot of guys are probably curious about that. And let me transition over here to the jigs that we're fishing, because we try not to talk about tackle like all the time, because Randy talks about tackle on his YouTube channel a lot, and everybody talks about tackle. There's like 15 tackle live streams, Randy, out there. So I like to talk about stuff other than tackle. But in terms of football, or in terms of jigs go, really my go-to jig, as you guys probably know, is the Fish the Moment Offshore Jig by Jewel Bait. Designed this jig for Jewel, and the reason that I love this jig more than anything is twofold. The first is that it comes through brush and rock and cover better than any jig I've ever thrown. It has a double cable weed guard on it. It has this really nice head design that has a rock. It kind of rocks the jig out of cover. It has this double flat spot on it, and it has a unique fall with a double cable or a double keeper guard on it. So it falls a little bit different. It just comes through cover like crazy. And you've thrown these too, Randy. What are your thoughts on the jig coming through cover and stuff?
Oh, it's almost completely weedless. I mean, and that's the most difficult thing a lot of times when you're fishing a football head jig on deep brush, depending upon the limb diameter that you're fishing, is that jig will roll over the top of that limb and get caught up, and then you've ruined the whole pile. But the weed guard system on that jig is just that I've never seen one that comes through brush as good as that does. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's not just a double cable guard. It's the head with the eye position, the eye angle, everything. It's been designed perfectly to come through brush. And I go through like 2 jigs a month. And I throw this jig so much. You guys have seen that in a lot of my videos. I throw it a ton. And I go through like 2 of these a month. And you actually can get 2 of these. It's a 5/8 ounce jig for $6.99 on jewelbait.com. Only place you can get them. So you get 2 jigs for $6. Pretty solid deal. And while you're there, one thing just to make a shameless plug for the sponsors is check out on jewelbait.com the new Fish Tool subscription box. This is a new offering by Jewel Baits, and basically it is a subscription box that gives you $60 worth of premium American-made fishing tackle for $35. It arrives in the mail every single month, and actually help pick out the baits that go in here every single month. So if you want to make sure you're getting like good baits to throw, Fish Tools box has all super premium baits. It's not like the factory leftovers, the discontinued colors that no one wanted, or the rejects. It's all good quality tackle that you can still purchase on Tackle Warehouse anywhere else. You're just getting it pretty much half off because it comes straight off their production line into this box. And because there's no retail markup, Jewel can basically sell it to you for half price. So definitely a great option. A lot of jigs. Jewel is known for jigs. So if you want to get better jig fishing this year, order this box. It'll have the right jigs for every single season, plus a bunch of other great baits. So just head over to jewelbait.com and go to the Fish Tool box. So sponsor plug over, Randy. So let's jump into the other jigs. Another jig I like to throw a lot is the Jewel Bait Tactical Pro Spider Jig. So this is a little bit heavier jig that again has that double cable guard on it. And this jig doesn't come through brush quite as well as the Fisherman Offshore Jig because of the head design, but it still comes through pretty well. And it has a really nice hook on it that's a super sturdy hook. And I throw this jig a lot when I'm flipping up shallow, pitching shallow cover. I'm not showing my screen. Here's the jig here, Tactical Pro Spider Jig. And it has this double cable guard, really nice thick hook, and it has this finesse profile to it. So I'll throw this jig a lot when I'm flipping, casting it around, fishing in shallower water. And you can put it on heavy line. You can put it on like 15-pound test to 20-pound test, rip them. And it's actually designed to support the special ops survivors, so it's a really good cause too on that. So I love this jig. And one thing I like about it is it comes in that 7/16 ounce size, and that's actually the third myth that, or the third mistake I see a lot of anglers make when they're jig fishing is they don't use a jig that's heavy enough. A lot of guys are throwing jigs that are as light as they can get away with. They say the lighter the jig, the better. But I actually find that for me, the heavier the jig I can get away with, the better. The more bites I get and the better bites I get. And if you look at the Fisherman Offshore Jig, it's a 5/8 ounce jig, which actually isn't even as heavy as you could go. A lot of times I might throw a 3/4 or a 1 ounce jig, but the 5/8 is a good any time size that just kind of works in all situations. And that's really not that heavy a jig. I throw the 7/16 ounce finesse jig, which a lot of guys will throw a 3/16 or a 5/16 ounce. And the reason we go to these heavier jigs is I want to make sure that bait is maintaining contact with the bottom. It's in the cover, it's sitting down there, making contact with the cover. I don't want that jig to be floating around somewhere away from the cover. I want to make sure it gets down in there, stays in the cover, and honestly, I find that even like 40-degree water, super cold water, fish will eat my 5/8 ounce Fisherman offshore jig, no problem. When I was catching those 6 and 7 pounders out of brush piles a week ago, water temps were 43 degrees. Doesn't matter the cold weather. You don't need these super light jigs. Another jig I love to throw is the jewel bait peewee football jig. This is basically a tiny jig that's like the size of a quarter. But the nice thing about it is that it comes in a pretty heavy size. You can throw a 7/16 ounce jig that's the size of a quarter. It's basically like a little ball of just straight lead. And these little jigs that are compact get a lot of bites, but because they're heavier, you can maintain bottom contact with them. And that's the biggest key with jig fishing, is keeping your bait on the bottom, feeling that bait through the presentation. So the heavier the jig you throw, usually the more consistent you're going to be in terms of keeping your bait around the cover and detecting the bites. Another jig I throw a lot is the Striking Hack Attack heavy cover flipping jig, and I'll throw this in like a 1 ounce or sometimes even a 1 1/4 ounce when I'm flipping even in like 2, 3, 4 foot of water, flooded bushes, heavy vegetation, and I catch a lot of fish on like a 3/4 ounce to a 1 1/4 ounce black and blue Hack Attack heavy cover flipping jig. So one thing I think the guys get scared away from with the jigs is they feel like the jig is too big or it's too heavy. But I find that a big profile bait, a heavier bait, it can get bit super well. And one great story I have is that I was fishing brush piles in Lake Dardanelle one summer in a night tournament. And my buddy was throwing a 10-inch worm, and I had a football jig on. And I was like, we were throwing around, and I broke off my Texas rig. We're throwing like a 3/16 ounce weight because the brush piles were in 5 or 6 foot of water, middle of the summer. And I broke off my Texas rig, and I picked up a 3/4 ounce football jig, fired in there, and caught a 4-pounder, fired back in there, caught a 5-pounder, throwing a 3/4 ounce jig in 5 foot of water on brush piles. So the heavy jig, big size doesn't really matter. Would you agree with all that, Randy?
Oh man, that's the topic right there that we could literally spend 8 hours talking about when you're talking about jig sizes, the rate of fall, and that type of stuff. But first of all, I'll say that I agree with you, Johnny, completely. That if you can get the bass to bite a heavy jig, you're so far ahead of everything because it's a lot more efficient. You can fish it in different water depths, different wind conditions. The bigger fish will usually bite the reaction of a heavy, fast-falling jig if you can get them to hit it. That being said, a lot of it just depends on the situation that you're in. I mean, we all know, what those situations are. It's water clarity, water temperature, the type of cover, the depth, the mood of the fish, that type of stuff. And another thing is your line size and your jig trailer is going to affect the fall of that jig completely too. And for me, it's about figuring out the rate of fall that fish wants that allows you to be most efficient. But like I said, if you can get those bass to bite a big heavy jig, most all the big bags of fish I've caught and the really big bass, like the 8 to 10 pound class fish that I've caught on a jig, have come on a 1/2 to 1 ounce jig. Although I fish them all different sizes. One of these days I'll have to break out my jig box here because I've got full profile jigs all the way from an 1/8 ounce up to an ounce. And you were talking about the spider jig a little bit. I want to give a little bit of story on that. That Jewel 9/16 ounce spider jig, the one that's got the wire hook. Do they still make it with a single wire weed guard?
It's a double wire now.
I've got about 100 of them. The single wire Jewel spider jig 9/16. That is the fish catchingest jig I have ever seen. If you need to cover deep water in a hurry. And for example, one of the things I like to do is I got onto it at Beaver Lake actually with this jig, covering a tremendous amount of water in that 15 to 20 foot zone around those deep cedar trees, just pitching and casting that 9/16 ounce spider jig around those trees. Super fast fall. It's a little compact jig. It falls like a rocket with a little bitty trailer on there, and they'll eat it up in clear water. And that's another thing that I have found is, in clear water, they will bite that big, heavy, fast falling jig better than any other jig you can throw. In fact, it's almost a requirement. If you have water visibility of over like 4 foot around any type of cover, I'm always fishing a big, heavy jig.
Yeah, and I've caught him even on like Lake Dardanelle in lily pads in 3 foot of water, flipping a 1 ounce jig in the middle of the summer on lily pads, catching 5 and 6 pounders, just jacking them over the side of the boat. Pretty awesome. So I don't know. I'm really a big fan of going to a heavier jig, not always worrying about trying to downsize. If I'm going to downsize my bait, I'd rather go to a shaky head and Ned rig, something like that. I don't really see the need to downsize your jig as much. If I'm throwing a jig, I'm going for 5 to 10 bites a day. That is it, and just going after the big bites. Would you agree, Randy?
One of the things that I've learned a lot, because like I said, I've been a jig fishing fanatic for many, many decades. The thing that I've learned a lot about jig fishing has been from watching Greg Hackney. If you guys watch Greg Hackney, I love Hackney's style because there's an energy about Hackney that is tied into a jig. If you've ever watched him, he is like the most primal jig fisherman I've ever seen ever. And he's the one that got me throwing the 1 ounce jig a lot shallow, because before Hackney, a lot of people didn't do that. I remember years ago, Brent Chapman told me he was flipping a 3/4 ounce jig, and I like fell out of my chair. I couldn't believe he was flipping such a heavy jig. And now Hackney has got everybody flipping this 1 ounce jig in shallow cover, winning tournaments on it. And he's opened our eyes to the effectiveness of it. And I've even seen some of your videos, Johnny, when you were flipping the big jig and some of those shallow bushes and how effective it was. And we've all seen it and started adopting it more.
Yeah.
Most people don't equate flipping in 2 foot of water with a 1 ounce jig. It's like they consider it overkill. But the more we understand about bass personality, the behavior and the mood of bass, and the things that trigger bass to strike a lure, Hackney's opened my eyes to that big time.
I don't know if you'll be ashamed of me or shocked or what, Randy, but I have flipped a jig or any soft plastic I have flipped in the last 2 years. I've only flipped one bait, and that's a 1 ounce jig. Every single flipping fish I've caught in the last 2 years has been on that 1 ounce hack attack jig. I do not flip ever. I do not flip. I that's like not in my repertoire. I do offshore. Whenever I go up shallow, I just take a 1 ounce jig. And like the last time I did, I was cracking them, catching 3 and 4 pounders. But like I just don't flip hardly at all. And when I do, it's just a giant jig. I don't know. That's just a me thing.
Yeah, it's most of the time, like I said, that's the deal. There are exceptions to the rule. I can remember one of the best jig days I ever had in my life. It was on an FLW tournament at the Chaffalaya Basin in Louisiana, and I was flipping cypress trees. And I knew that those fish would bite a jig. Everything was set up just perfect for it. And I was tweaking and tweaking and tweaking and experimenting. And eventually what I did is I took a 1/4 ounce jig, a full lunker lure 1/4 ounce jig, with a big, super chunk on it, a big giant profile jig. And I filed that 1/4 ounce head down to where it was like an 1/8 of an ounce or even a 16th. And it just floated like a potato chip going down through the water. And I wound up almost winning that tournament on that little full size 1/8 ounce jig. But that's an exception to the rule. Most of the time, those big ones want that heavy fast fall.
Awesome. And I do want to cover some jig trailers as well here, Randy. Before we do that, I just wanted to remind people, because here's some jig trailers we're going to talk about in just a second, but I wanted to remind people before it's too late to sign up for, go to fishmoment.com and head over to the virtual seminars page and sign up for the upcoming jerkbait seminar this Thursday. It's January 7th, coming up in 2 days. And we've had to open up some more spots for the seminar, Randy, because it has been so popular and in so much demand. And Randy is going to be breaking down everything you know about wintertime jerkbait fishing, from the areas, the baits, casting angles. We're going to have graphics. I mean, if you guys like this live stream, you're going to love the seminar. We have a lot more detailed graphics, explanations, everything like that. We're talking about bait modifications. And Randy was actually one of the original designers of the Megabass Vision 110. You sent him actually some old weighted rogues for him to use as the model for the 110. Isn't that right, Randy?
Yeah, that was back in the late 90s. In fact, they've still got them over in Japan somewhere. They've got like 12 of my best rogues ever. And we worked with Megabass for almost 2 years before they finally came up with a final design of the 110. And that 110 was based a lot upon, the jerkbait fishing that we do here in the Ozarks and what we're going to talk about in the seminar on Thursday.
For sure. So definitely check that out. I think we have about 10 more spots left. People have been signing up like crazy. So if you do want to get in, I definitely check it out. And the seminars are all recorded, and we send you a copy of the seminar that you can watch back as many times as you want. So even if you can't make it live, you can, sign up for the seminar and we'll send you the recording. And we also have an advanced electronics seminar coming up where I'm going to be sharing all of my secrets for how to become more efficient and effective with your electronics. It's a great way to kind of prepare for the upcoming tournament season. I'll be talking about how to differentiate the different size of fish on your fish finder, whether fish are active or not, whether you're looking at a good school of fish that you should come back to in a tournament, whether you shouldn't, all these different things. And it's going to be a super detailed seminar. And if you have signed up for one of my electronic seminars in the past, I'm changing them up a little bit. So this seminar actually may be really useful for those who've even attended one of my seminars before. And I'll be changing up the seminars a little bit going forward, guys, just to kind of streamline the content. So this is going to be more focused on like dialing in the perfect settings and really understanding your fish finder. So definitely sign up for that seminar if you're interested. And then obviously there's always our lake map breakdowns if you want to check those out. 40 GPS waypoints on lakes all across the country, broken up by season. And we also have the personal lake breakdowns you can purchase here. And Randy gives you 40 GPS waypoints. You can put straight in your fish finder, view on Google Earth. He gives detailed area descriptions as well as a breakdown of the lake in terms of the key things you need to know about the lake. So definitely check out these personal lake breakdowns if we don't have your lake available here in the stock maps. And we're going to put out spring maps here very, very soon for a lot of the lakes all across the country. So that's that, Randy. I do want to talk about trailers, but before we talk about trailers, I want to talk about another myth here real quick, because I like talking about baits, but I also like talking about the real stuff that helps people catch fish. So the one thing that I see a lot of guys mess up when they're jig fishing is they miss the bite. They don't actually know when a fish is biting their jig. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why guys stop fishing jigs, because they just don't know when the fish are actually on their bait. Now, I have a really great story about that. I was actually doing an on-the-water fishing lesson with a guy, and we were on Table Rock Lake, and I was just absolutely hammering him on the football jig. I mean, boom, boom. I think about like 20 fish. I had like 2 or 3 close to 4-pound smallmouth. 3.5-pound largemouth, just wrecking them. And the guy I was with, he could not get a bite to save his life. He was like, man, I can't get bit. And I was like giving him my rod, casting out there, and he wasn't doing anything. And he was setting the hook a lot. He was like, oh, there's one, and he would miss it. And I thought maybe his hook set was wrong or whatever. Well, about 2/3 of the way through the day, he was just sitting there, and then his rod started bowing. He was like, oh, I'm in a rock. And he starts shaking it like it's a rock. And then a 4-pound smallmouth jumps out of the water and spits his jig. And he's like, oh, that was a fish. I didn't even know it. And what had happened is he was setting the hook on every rock he came in contact with pretty much all day, and he was shaking and trying to get unhung all of the fish that were biting him all day. He was mixing up the fish with the rocks in terms of how they felt. And so he probably had 15 fish that he literally shook off throughout the fishing day. And that's just something that happens a ton with jig fishermen, is that the bite is so much different from a bite on a Texas rig worm or a spinnerbait or a crankbait. The only jig bite that's really kind of obvious to me is like a swim jig bite, where you can either see them or they like absolutely like slam it and you feel it in your rod. Most jig bites are going to be what probably Randy would call like a pressure bite. But what I kind of think about jig bite is really what happens when fish eat a jig is that they come up to your jig, they suck it in, and they just sit there and hold it. And most of the jig bites that I get are not, or when I sense the bite, is not when I actually feel the weight of the fish. Instead, it's usually when I don't feel any weight. It's when you're fishing that jig and you're throwing it down there and you are lifting up, and then all of a sudden you feel less weight than you normally feel when you're lifting up that jig. That's just because those fish have grabbed your jig and have swam up just a little bit, and when you lift up, you kind of feel that weightless feeling. That's about 50% of the jig bites. The next 40% of the jig bites are when you lift up and you just feel it nice and solid, and you keep pulling and it doesn't pull over the top of like a limb or a log. Now, there's a little bit of nuance there because sometimes you can do that and it can be a tree. And I do set the hook on some trees every once in a while, Randy. That's nothing to be ashamed about. But sometimes you feel that, and you'll just feel that kind of nice tension and pull, and sometimes that's going to be a fish as well. But I would say that the bite that a lot of guys miss on that jig is that weightless feeling when they lift up and the jig isn't quite as heavy. And I think the reason that a lot of guys miss these bites is that they're not actually fishing a heavy enough jig to really feel that jig. What I mean by that is when I'm throwing a jig like an offshore jig, like the Jewel offshore jig, it's a 5/8 ounce bait. I want to make sure that I can feel that bait and feel the bottom, and I want to be making sure I know where that jig is at all times. If you're casting your jig out and you don't actually feel the cover or feel the bottom, usually you're either not on the bottom or you're throwing a jig that's too light for you to sense what's going on. A couple of things you can do to help that is make sure your bait gets the bottom, using fluorocarbon line, and a lot of times using lighter line, like 14 pound, 12 to 14 pound test on your jigs, just at the beginning so you can really feel that jig on the bottom. And then the last thing is just to throw a jig a lot to get a sense for how heavy that jig is on the end of your rod. And then when you lift up and it feels a little bit lighter, that's when you know you need to set the hook. It's a very nuanced bite. It's not super easy to get a grasp of, and that's why you have to spend a lot of time on it. But I would say if you have struggled fishing a jig in the past, 90% chance that the reason you didn't like fishing the jig is because you didn't detect most of the bites you were getting, and you were actually missing those bites. Would you agree with that, Randy?
No doubt. From my experience, that the way you described it is pretty much right on. For me, when I'm fishing a jig, there's basically three different types of bites that you get. And the bites that you get, the way that I get them, a lot of it depends on where you're fishing, the type of fish you're fishing for, and how pressured those fish are. Because for me, the three type of jig bites are this. My favorite jig bite, and the one that you get when the fish are not pressured and they're really aggressive, is when you flip or pitch or cast into a particular area and you just see your line jump. That's just, it happens on a jerkbait sometimes like that. When you see your line jump, that means that bass has inhaled that lure from a long distance away, and it's usually a quality fish that has the power to inhale a jig from that distance away. That's the first bite. The second bite.
And how often does that happen, by the way, Randy? Because I feel like for me on a jig, that happens like 5% of the time.
That's not very often. I mean, like I said, that's something that usually happens that on a place that does not get much fishing pressure, but it is my favorite jig bite. It's the most exciting jig bite there is. The second bite that you get on it is like what Jonny was talking about, where the fish just pick the bait up and they hold it and they don't move with it. Now, to me, this is the most difficult bite to detect, because the only way that you can really detect that bite is by putting pressure on that line until you feel movement or not. Because a lot of times you can get, even good anglers will get fooled, because if a bass picks that bait up and holds it, you can either pull it and it'll be a rock, like you'll pull it over a rock or a limb, or you'll pull it and you'll start feeling a little bit of surging a little bit with it. And the third type of bite is when you pitch it out there, you work the bait a couple times, and all of a sudden it just feels like it becomes weightless, and your line starts swimming out. Most of the time, those are the three type of jig bites, and this is when the critical, and this is sort of getting away from the topic a little bit, but it's sort of the critical time frame is when you get that bite. It's really important on a jig to set that hook on a tight line, because what happens if you get one of those bites, say you flip in there and your line jumps, all of a sudden you're all jacked up and you reel down and you set the hook, and you'll get slack in that line a lot of times on a jig hook. And what happens is when you set the hook on a jig, especially a large diameter head, like a 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce size head on a jig, if you pull on that jig and snap it real hard, you actually you'll force the mouth of that bass open with that jig head. And a lot of times you'll have that bass on for 3 or 4 cranks and it'll come off. So regardless of the type of bite that you get on a jig, don't get in a big hurry. Let the fish swim a little bit with it, tighten up your line, and just pull back on a tight line, and you'll land a lot more jig fish.
Yep, for sure. Question from Gary. He asks, do you mark your brush piles with a fish marker. I'll sometimes drop a buoy on my brush piles, Gary, but most of the time I just use waypoints. I have a great video on that. Just go to Fish the Moment, how to hit offshore sweet spots every cast, or how to hit offshore spots, Fish the Moment. It's the best video I have on my channel. No one seems to have ever watched it because I get that question more than anything. How do you get your bait on an offshore piece of structure? That's, if you're fishing a jig and you're not able to get your bait on the brush pile you mark, that's a big problem. So go check out that video. I get that question so much, and I just tell you, type in Fish the Moment, how to hit offshore sweet spots, or how to hit offshore areas. The video will pop up. It's the best video on my channel. Just go check it out. But sorry, Randy, I wanted to get that out there. But yeah, that's good stuff. And I'm going to make a hook set video here pretty soon, Randy, about how to properly set the hook, because I think a lot of guys are not setting the hook properly from what I'm seeing. I watch a lot of like random YouTube videos nowadays, and like no one sets the hook very well.
Look, I'll give you guys a little history lesson in the hook setting of jigs. Back in the early 1990s, Gary Klein and I, we worked together almost every tournament, hand in hand, in the Bassmaster tournaments. And Gary's a big flipper, I'm a big flipper, and back then we did a lot of flipping together. And we analyzed this whole hook set and how many fish you lost on the jig. And back then, we didn't understand this whole thing about setting on a slack line. Everybody did it. And what we did to counter it back then is we used fiberglass flipping sticks. We actually had 7.5 and 8 foot long fiberglass flipping sticks. And that fiberglass actually, the give on that fiberglass actually allowed us to snap set hard like that, because you didn't have the force of the rod tip to open that fish's mouth up. But it was only after we figured out that you can't snap set on a jig and you have to pull on a jig as to when you started becoming more effective. And it's we lost a lot of big fish over a course of 5 or 6 years learning that lesson.
Oh man, that's good stuff right there. Awesome. Well, I want to talk about the last mistake that guys make when they're fishing a jig, and it kind of is similar to the not using heavy enough jig, but this is probably the most common mistake of the 5. This is the most common, and that's that guys don't actually let their jig get down to the bottom. So guys and gals they're casting their jig out, and it's just randomly out in the middle of the water column. And I see this happen so often. I actually have a graphic here, guys. Here's a little jig. I got a nice jig here, and this is what I see a lot of guys do when I'm on the lake with them. They'll let that jig hit the water. They'll engage their reel. They'll click their reel as soon as that jig hits the water, and then they'll just kind of let it fall. And what happens is, because you engage your reel right when that bait hits the water, you have kind of a tight line, and that bait's going to pendulum. And it's going to pendulum and pendulum and pendulum. And then all of a sudden, you're going to wait like 10 seconds, and you're like, it's probably hit the bottom by now. And they start working it. And they're working it, and they're working it way over the fish in like 15 feet of water, over 20 foot of water. And that bait never hits the bottom once. And because that line is tight, they're just working their jig all the way back to the boat, just in the middle of the cover, and they're like, man, where's that brush pile? I can never find it. Where's the rock? And they never get their bait even close to the fish. So one of the biggest things you have to do when you fish a jig is, whenever you cast that bait out there, whether it's pitching the jig, flipping the jig, you want to let that bait fall on a slack line. What that means is, when that bait hits the water, you need to actually give the bait line, pull some line out of your reel. If you're in deeper water, you may have to pull out more line. And if you're in shallow water, less line. But you want that jig to fall on a slack line. The line is basically not tight. You want a loose line. And you want that thing to be loose so that that jig won't actually get pulled towards the boat. It'll fall straight down to the bottom. This will get that bait right down the bottom where the fish are. And then when you start dragging it, you're going to be in contact with that bottom. Once you're down there, you want to actually make sure that that jig is in contact with the bottom or the cover the entire casts. The only exception is when maybe you want to like rip the jig off the bottom and let it fall back down. That's called stroking a jig. But regardless, if you pop it up, you want to make sure it gets all the way back down to the bottom. And you'll know if that jig's down there and around the cover if you're throwing a heavy enough jig. If you're throwing a 5/8 to 3/4 ounce jig, you'll know that jig is down there in the bottom. And if you're struggling to make bottom contact, go to a heavier jig, even in shallow water, 3 to 10 foot of water. Go to a 3/4 ounce jig or a 5/8 ounce jig, because you'll guarantee that you'll be making bottom contact, and those fish don't necessarily care all that much a lot of times if you have a heavier jig, sometimes it can maybe get you a few extra bites to go to a little bit lighter jig. But when you're learning jig fishing, I cannot stress enough the importance of going to a heavier jig to make sure that bait is making bottom contact, and also let that bait fall in a slack line. Give your bait line, it's almost like you're picking out a backlash. Every time, it looks like that when I'm kind of fishing, you cast out and it's not like you're picking out a backlash, you're just literally letting the line out so it falls in a slack line down. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Man, it was cracking me up when you're talking about that because I have seen anglers make that mistake so often. People that are learning about jigs or people that don't fish much. You're exactly right, and they'll throw it out there, and like I said, they just never get into the strike zone. And there's a couple different things on this. First of all, wind and current have a big part to play in that too, because everything that Jonny was talking about there it's multiplied tenfold by wind or current to make it even worse. So that is what everybody has to do when you first. I don't care if you're fishing an offshore, if you're fishing 30 foot deep, or if you're flipping bushes, or if you're flipping boat docks, you have got to peel that line out to get that bait to fall straight down there, because that not only puts that bait in the strike zone where it needs to be immediately, but that just increases your time in the sweet spot down there. And jig fishing is all about angle. It's all about generating strikes from the fall rate and angles. And you cannot pitch it out there and let it swing back on a tight line. That's one of the biggest mistakes I see, that like if you take, like a kid fishing, somebody like a 7 or 8 year old kid that doesn't know how to fish, that's what they do every time. So, and even I think good anglers are guilty of that a little bit. Yeah, you got to let that jig fall on the slack line. And but even though it's falling on a slack line, you really need to pay attention as that bait's falling, and it needs to be sort of on a controlled slack line. It's not like you just peel out a bunch of loose line and it's just falling and you don't know when it even hits the bottom. There's a combination of the slack line fall and aware of what that jig's doing at the same time. Because the thing that I found about jig fishing is that at least 75% of the time, the bass is going to bite that jig from the time it touches the bottom until you hop it one time. For me, most of the time, especially in a shallow water pitching and flipping situation, 25% of the time they'll get it after you've worked at 5 or 10 feet. But most of the time, if there's a good one there and you've made a cast in a high percentage sweet area, the bass is going to have that jig in its mouth almost as soon as it hits the bottom.
Yeah, and when Randy's talking about a controlled slack line, the way you do that basically is when you're feeding out your line most of the time is going to be sitting on top of the water at some point. There's a point where your line is entering the water. And so what you want to do is you want to watch where the line enters the water, and if that line is moving forward into the water, it means your jig is still falling. And so even though you're pulling out a bunch of slack line, when you pitch it out there and you let out slack, watch your line as it's falling in. And if you are in 10 foot of water and your jig stops after 2 seconds, it means that fish has probably already got the bait in its mouth, because it's usually going to fall for maybe 5 or 6 seconds. And that's when you can reel up all that slack and then set the hook on them. So that's how you kind of do that. Awesome. So those are the top 5 common mistakes. Guys, I want to talk about jig trailers. We got a bunch of other questions too, and we're going to get to all those. So just to recap these, and then we'll get into jig trailers and questions. The top 5 most common jig fishing mistakes are not fishing a specific target, fishing under the wrong conditions, fishing a jig that is too light, so not heavy enough, missing the bite, and not letting the bait get to the bottom. Those are basically your 5 common mistakes. And if you want to recap that, you can watch the video back on YouTube afterwards, or download the Fish Moment podcast through the Apple and Spotify podcast apps, so you can actually listen to the podcast there. So let's talk a little bit about trailers. I know what trailers you throw, Randy, and I don't have that big of a preference. I basically throw a Strike King Menace Grub, a Strike King Rage Craw, and a big salty chunk zoom trailer. So I like the big salty chunk trailer here. And then if we go to the Strike King real quick, I throw a Strike King Rage Craw. Everyone knows what a Rage Craw is, and a Strike King regular size Menace Grub. I throw the Menace Grub when I'm in colder water, let's say less than 60 degree water temperature, and I throw the Rage Craw when I am fishing in warmer water, so above 60 degree water. And I'll throw that big salty chunk, this one right here, when I want a slower fall and when I want a bigger kind of meteor bites. Usually when that water temperature is below 45 degrees, I'll go to this. Or if I'm like flipping in the summer and I want a slower fall rate. But those are really my 3 trailers. I'm actually working on a trailer with Jewel right now, Randy, that we're going to be putting out, and it's going to be the ultimate jig trailer. It kind of takes combination of all these different trailers. It's going to be one of the most versatile jig trailers in the market, and it's coming out sometime here in like middle of the spring, late spring, something like that. So be on the lookout for that. But what jig trailers would you recommend? I have a Tackle Warehouse pulled up here, Randy, so I can show them while you're recommending.
Well, for me, I know, Johnny fishes. When he's fishing jigs, he's fishing football head most of the time.
Yeah.
I'm guessing, out of your jig fishing, you probably do 80% football head jig fishing in the course of a year with the offshore fishing you do.
Yeah.
For me, the opposite. When I'm fishing a jig, 80 to 90% of the time, I'm flipping and pitching it around some type of shallow cover, whether it be, docks, rocks, wood, bushes, that type of stuff. So our jig fishing techniques are different as far as mine and Johnny's go. So for me, I know a lot of people have gotten into the jig trailers that have the curly tails, like the Rage Craws or the Speed Craws, that type of stuff. For me, I like the chunk type trailers better. I like the Zoom, either the Super Chunk Junior, or the Big Salty Chunk. Those are my 3 go-to jig trailers. I know a lot of guys like the master jig fisherman like Randall Tharp. I mean, that's the same type of trailers he throws a lot. But then you got some of the guys like Hackney that like the Rage Craws. So a lot of it is just a matter of your personal preference. To me, the jig trailer that you do has a lot to do with how you want the jig profile to look, because a jig profile will alter. I mean, a jig trailer will alter the profile and the fall tremendously of the jig. So that's all considerations you have to make based upon water clarity, water temperature, the size of fish you're catching, the time of the year, the type of cover you're fishing. There's a lot of variables that go into it, but I'm going to guess that for me, probably 75% of the time, I'm using the Big Salty Chunk or the Zoom Super Chunk on my jigs.
Good stuff. I know you just made a video recently about the old Uncle Josh pork frogs. They're coming back. I used to actually, the guys from Uncle Josh, they were up in Wisconsin, and so I feel like an idiot now. I knew all the guys from Uncle Josh. I went fishing with them all the time up there, and they basically said, we'll give you an unlimited supply of any Uncle Josh product you want. They were just giving me the stuff whatever I wanted, and I was like, oh, pork, it's gross, it was annoying, I like plastic better, and I didn't take any of it. I was like, I'm never going to use it, you guys just keep it, I don't care. And man, I could have made a killing off of all the pork I could have sold. They were going to give me like cases of pork, and I didn't take it.
It's selling for like $15 a jar now if you can get it. I tell you how big of a pork fan I was. I used to have for 15 years, I would carry plastic Tupperware bowls. Like I'm talking about this big, like big plastic Tupperware bowls. I'd have one of them full of blue ones, one of them full of brown ones, one of them full of black ones. I'd have like 100 pork frogs in each one of these big Tupperware things. And I'd carry them with me to the tournaments. That's how much I used to use pork. I was really bummed out when they quit making it.
That's hilarious. Sounds like also a lot of guys are wanting to know about pork or about the different trailers, Randy, for different water temperatures. That might be some YouTube content for you. Randy has some awesome tackle tips and stuff on this channel, Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett. So maybe that's some videos that come up here soon, Randy.
Yeah, I mean, jig fishing, I mean, that people don't realize how many variables are involved in jig fishing. I mean, it's literally, it's probably the most complex as far as the different options that you have of any lure category out there. In my opinion, jerkbait fishing is the most complicated technique, but jig fishing is the one that has the most variables to the bait itself, because there's so many different combinations. You got your size, your colors, your skirt material, the trailer combinations, everything that goes with it. It would take a book to cover everything, a thick book.
Oh yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, we have a bunch of questions, really great questions about tungsten versus lead and a bunch of other stuff. And we're going to get into all those, but really quick, I just want to remind you guys to head over to fishthemoment.com and check out the virtual seminars we have coming up. This Thursday, in 2 days, January 7th, we have Randy's Advanced Jerkbait Fishing Seminar for the winter. He's be covering all the best areas, what to look for, the best conditions for a jerkbait, casting angles, jerkbait modifications, everything you could think about for jerkbait fishing. Randy's going to spill the beans and give up all of his secrets. He helped design the Megabass Vision 110 jerkbait, the most popular jerkbait on the market. So he knows his stuff with jerkbait fishing. And we are going to be recording the seminar, so even if you can't make it from 6 to 9 on Thursday, we'll send you a recording if you sign up. So don't be afraid to sign up. We'll send you the recording very soon after, and you can watch it all back. It's a 3-hour seminar with a lot of awesome information. And then I also have an advanced electronics seminar coming up covering 2D sonar side imaging and down imaging, how to dial in your settings, how to determine what fish are active and you can actually get to bite based on what you see in your fish finder, how to know if the fish are going to bite now versus later, when should you come back to those fish, a lot of cool settings, tricks, all kinds of stuff. So check out this webinar if you guys want to dial in your electronics game for this summer. I won't be doing the seminar again probably till the summer, so if you want to get geared up for the tournament season, definitely sign up. There's only 30 spots available, so sign up as quick as you can. That's going to be coming up January 21st. So that is that for that. Oh, also check out the lake breakdowns, by the way, too. All of our lake breakdowns, 40 GPS waypoints, detailed area descriptions. We also have personal lake breakdowns available from Randy, who will look at any lake in the country, even if we don't have it marked here, and he'll give you 40 GPS waypoints that go straight in your fish finder with instructions on how to do that. So all of that. So let's jump back over here to questions. One question we got, and I think it was from, I don't want to steal the credits here, but I think it was from Steven. I'm trying to find the question here. It's basically, what are our thoughts about tungsten versus lead, both for jigs? I think it's just the tungsten versus lead for jigs. What are your thoughts there? Have you ever thrown a tungsten jig, Randy?
I've never fished a tungsten jig. I fish tungsten sinkers on my, on soft plastics all the time. But to me, tungsten is a superior material. I mean, I don't think anybody has really came out with an affordable line of tungsten jigs that I'm aware of. But anytime you're dealing with a smaller profile, that's a good thing. So I'm all for tungsten, absolutely.
Yeah, and that was Ryan Williams. Yeah, if tungsten wasn't so dang expensive, I would throw a tungsten jig as well. That's why we kind of designed the Fisherman offshore jig with the lead poured down the shank of the hook. It makes the head smaller, which helps it come through cover. So if you could then pour that lead down the shank of the hook and then make the head even smaller than that while still keeping the weighting right, that would even be better. So I think a tungsten jig would be great. It's just cost-wise. I mean, I'm throwing a jig in the middle of brush piles and stuff. You're going to break off eventually. So I think it's just probably not as cost-effective. I'd rather spend my money on other stuff, I guess, than tungsten jigs, put it that way. Okay, so that was that question. Next question, do you downsize fishing spotted bass? That's from Ira. I honestly, the thing I do with my jigs is I don't downsize the weight of the jig. I'll still throw my 5/8 or 3/4 ounce jig. I just trim up the skirt. So I'll make the skirt a lot shorter and I'll go to a smaller trailer for spotted bass as opposed to downsizing the weight of the jig. Would you agree there, Randy?
Yeah, for me, I mean, that's a great question too. For me, it depends on the species of spotted bass that I'm fishing. I have found out that the Alabama spotted bass, that's on the Coosa River and all the Alabama lakes down there, they will bite a big jig. They'll bite a big jig the same way as a largemouth bass will. But if you're fishing more of the traditional Kentuckys, the spotted bass from the Ozarks, the spotted bass like in some of the Georgia lakes over there, they prefer a more downsized profile. But so that's sort of the two scenarios I've seen unfold with it. That tournament that we just got done, our last Bassmaster Open we had there at Lay Lake. I mean, I was fishing a full size jig with the Zoom Super Chunk on it, and every fish I weighed in was a spotted bass on a full size giant jig.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't think it matters all that much, other than with the. If they can get the bait in their mouth, that's all that matters. Another question from Ira, another good question. In cold water, are you dragging the jig super slow, like crawling it, maintaining contact with the bottom of the cover the whole time? Yeah, so I'm maintaining bottom contact all the time in any season, regardless of the water temperature. One thing I'll say is that I fish a jig pretty fast. If you watch me fish a football jig, I cast that thing out there, I let it hit the bottom, and I'm dragging it like drag, stop, drag, stop. I mean, I'm moving that thing pretty quick. I'm not necessarily fishing my jig slow in the summer. So when I'm fishing it in the winter, I'm probably fishing my jig in the winter the same speed that you guys are fishing your jigs in the summer, which means you're probably casting your jig out, letting it sink to the bottom, hopping it a few times, letting it sit for 2 or 3 seconds, moving it a few feet, letting it sit for a few seconds. That's like my wintertime retrieve. My summer and like warmer weather retrieve, basically anytime the water is above 60 degrees, I'm firing that thing out there, letting it hit the bottom, and I am dragging it maybe 5 to 10 feet at a time, maybe even more, and then pausing it, moving it, pausing it. I'm moving it quite a bit. I'm not trying to soak that bait in an area. My thoughts, whenever I get a lot of my jig bites, that fish will bite it as soon as that bait comes in contact with the bottom. And the other time they bite it is right after I make that big pull and it stops. That's when they bite it. And I think that fishing that jig faster and moving it further makes it act like a fleeing crawfish. And that quick movement where it moves away from quickly, that's what triggers the bites. And I've been seeing that a lot actually on the live scope. Even in super cold water, when you think those fish are going to be lethargic, they'll still chase a bait up and down the water column and moving fast and stuff like that. No problem, even in super cold water. I mean, I've seen fish in Wisconsin blow up on a frog through thin sheets of ice in the middle of the winter. So a fish will eat a frog through a thin sheet of ice in the middle of the winter with frozen water. They will eat a jig fished at a decent pace. Would you agree there, Randy?
Yeah, no doubt. And that question is it's relative to what you consider cold water and what the visibility of that water is in. The colder, the dirtier water, the less I'm hopping it, the more I'm dragging it, and it gets a little bit higher hops and a little bit faster drag as the water gets cleaner and warmer.
Yep. Yep. Let's see here. Trying to find some more questions. What's the jig that you've caught the most fish on over your lifetime, Randy?
For me, it's been that lunker lure, the rattling lunker lure jig. I used to be sponsored by lunker lure. I'm not anymore, but I was for about a decade. And I've caught more bass on that jig flipping than I have any other jig out there for sure.
And you like that rattling jig?
Yeah, I like the lunker lure rattleback jig. It's the one that Tommy Biffle used to use constantly. He's the one that made it famous. And I just, Denny Brower actually used to use that jig too. And, it's the one I've used and still use a lot.
And when do you go to a rattle versus not a rattle when flipping?
I like a rattle most all the time in my jig fishing, unless I'm fishing super clear water with finesse trailers, like, down rocky bluffs, rocky banks, that type of stuff. But anytime my jig is like over something or around some type of an isolated target, I think that will help on a jig. It's because it's real subtle. It's not a rattle on a jig is not like a rattle on a crankbait or anything like that. It's more of it's almost like the noise that a crawdad would make, just scurrying along the bottom. So I've never seen it, be a negative. I prefer it actually.
Awesome. Yeah, I've put jigs in or rattles in my jigs when I'm fishing offshore, and I mean I haven't seen any change in the results. The Fisherman offshore jig actually has a rattle band collar, so you can add a rattle to that jig, and I do it sometimes, but like I don't know. For me, offshore, it doesn't really make that big of a difference. I can see it making a difference up shallow, though, flipping. Again, the only time I ever flip a jig is when I'm throwing a 1-ounce jig. And I think with a 1-ounce jig, it doesn't matter. Those fish are just biting it because it's flying past their face at 500 miles an hour. So that's the reason they bite it. But that's my type of flipping anyways. I don't know how you flip all the time, Randy. It's to me, it's like the most boring technique in the entire world. Just randomly, just going down the bank. I can't do it.
It's boring until you get 4 or 5 pounder on it. But I can remember back, if you guys can ever get a chance to watch some of the old Bassmaster of Tommy Biffle back in the early '90s, that's all that dude used to fish. I mean, you'd see him with his lunker lure rattleback jig, and he'd have his salt craw, and he'd bite part of the salt craw off, and that's what he'd fish all the time. And he proved it to me because, man, he was a dominating force during that time frame on that rattling jig.
That's awesome. John says he caught his first bass of 2021 Sunday with the Fisherman with Offshore Jig, a 3-pounder. That's what I'm talking about. Good stuff right there. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to keep making videos here, Randy. I'm going to be doing a video this Friday about my new boat setup. It's my budget Jacob Wheeler boat setup with my live scope, my 360 imaging, all that stuff. I was able to make the Jacob Wheeler setup for literally half the price. It's still not cheap, but you guys will see in the video how I did it. It's a pretty cool one coming out Friday. And I'll be doing a live scope video where I absolutely hammered them again on this Megabass Magdraft Freestyle 6-inch swim bait on a 1-ounce underspin. Look at that thing. Giant bait. I can't believe that thing is so torn up. It came through for 2 days of fishing. Dozen or so 4+ pounders, some 6-pounders. So that's going to be a fun video. I'm going to be explaining the basics of live scope. And I also have a video coming out with the Fisherman with Offshore Jig catching 6 and 7-pounders out of brush piles. So really cool content. We're going for the quality over quantity approach on the Fish the Moment channel. So we're going to be doing a lot of 30-minute videos with the drone graphics, stuff like that. So if you guys like the video graphics, all those things, sonar recordings, that's what's going to be on there. And then for the more consistent daily uploads with just a lot of fishing tips, head over to Randy's channel, Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett. And he is giving you a ton of information about pretty much everything bass fishing, some opinions on bass fishing. Great stuff there. So check out his channel if you haven't seen that already. And just a reminder, one more time, to head over to the Fish the Moment website, fisherman.com, and check out our virtual seminar. Definitely a great way to learn about some advanced jerkbait fishing or the electronic seminar I'll be doing later this month. So that's it for us, guys. Randy, anything else to add on jig fishing before we sign off?
Man, just learn it, guys. Like I said, I know a lot of people, they're hesitant to get in jig fishing. It's a big commitment to learn all the different jig fishing techniques. And I hear a lot of people that fish plastic worms a lot. They think that it's a big leap to go to a jig.
Yeah.
But actually, if you can fish a plastic worm and you know what a bite feels like on a plastic worm, you'll be a really good jig angler. And it will definitely increase the average size of your fish. So, I would highly suggest everybody make a commitment to becoming a better jig angler.
For sure. And guys, if you enjoyed this live stream or if you've been watching this YouTube video all the way to this point, definitely leave a like down this video. It helps out the algorithm on the YouTube video so much. Every video, if you can just leave a like, it like doubles the views practically on the videos if everyone just leaves a like. So leave a like down this live stream. Just go and hit the thumbs up button down below. It would help us out so much. And YouTube, the algorithm is so weird that we appreciate any help we can get there. And also subscribe to Fish the Moment if you want to get notified of all of our upcoming live streams. We do them every single Tuesday. We also post these live streams as well as our Fish the Moment YouTube content to the Fish the Moment podcast on the Apple and the Spotify app. So just go to Fish the Moment podcast on there and you can listen to all of the audio from these clips and maybe re-listen to it on the way to the lake if you felt like it was just too much information to consume at one time. So really appreciate everyone watching. We appreciate all the support. The support on Patreon has been amazing this month, on the website. Thank you guys for helping us continue to put out great content, spend our time fishing and teaching you guys as much as we can, and also learning, like I kind of did today, about the live scope. So, Randy, excited to kick off 2021, and should be a great year for fishing, and best of luck everyone on the water. See you guys later. Have a good night.